So do you notice any difference in these two sets of statements? My boss is so annoying. I need to learn to have more patience with my boss. My mother is so manipulative. I need to learn to be a little less enmeshed with my mother. Our country is going to hell. I need to help this wounded and divided country begin to heal. My church doesn't care about me at all. I need to help my church become a more caring community. Feel the difference? Both sets of statements identify a problem. They have some truth to them. The first statements kind of feel good, right? They have an emotional payoff. There's an emotional payoff to complaining about the state of things, the state of the world. Outrage feels good in the moment, or else we wouldn't do it. But there's one important difference. The first pair of statements may feel empowering, but they're not. They're actually disempowering. The second set of statements locate the solution, or at least the beginning of the solution, within ourselves. And in that way, they are a lot more empowering. It's hard to change ourselves, I know, but isn't it even harder to try to change other people? Have you discovered that people aren't as likely to jump on your plan for them as you might be for yourself? Have you ever found that people aren't getting on board in the way that you want them to? I have to remind myself regularly as a preacher that control is not a fruit of the Spirit, but self-control is. Well, if you're like me, you'd rather control other people than to actually work on yourself. But have you noticed that trying to fix everybody else isn't as effective as you'd like it to be? They don't seem to get it, and maybe they never will. And have you noticed that the more you complain about somebody, the more annoying they get? Or the more you complain about a situation, the more annoying it gets. Complaining may feel good, but ultimately it does not lead to good outcomes. So what's the alternative? Well, maybe we can stop saying God has a plan for your life, and here it is, and start asking God, well, what's your plan for my life? Maybe we can stop, as Jesus taught, trying to take the speck out of everybody else's eye and start to deal with the log in our own. Maybe we can stop trying to fix everything else and everybody else and start fixing the only person that we really have the power to change. Lent is a season of doing hard work. We forget that discipleship is a discipline. It's hard work. Why would we expect faith and spirituality to be any different than physical exercise? It's a discipline. And during Lent, we commit to some discipline. Lent is a time of renewal. It's a time of repentance. It's a time to reflect. To reflect on whether our behaviors and our actions are aligned with our deepest values. It's a time to repent, which means to return to God. As Liz read, the prophet Joel calls us to return to God with all our heart. It's a time to renew our relationship not only with God, but with ourselves and with each other, our brothers and sisters in faith. This Lent, as we do every Lent, we're going to pick some hard stuff to work with, and we're going to work with 3 spiritual practices. And these are right out of the Sermon on the Mount. This is the heart of what Jesus is teaching. And the fact that Jesus talks about all 3 of them leads one to believe that they were very common. They were common at his time. And they've been common in the Judeo-Christian tradition from the beginning. And what's even more interesting to me is that not only they're common in our tradition, you find these practices in all the major religions of the world. That ought to say something. These practices work. They're time-tested. They pack a powerful punch. They can change us in incredible ways. And what are those practices? Prayer, almsgiving, and fasting. So next week, we're going to look at prayer. We're going to look at 3 forms of prayer over 3 weeks: centering prayer, examine of consciousness, and intercessory prayer. And then the final week, we're going to look at giving to the poor, almsgiving. Later in this service, we're going to hear about our Lenten project that we're raising money and awareness for, the Appalachia Service Project. Penny will tell us about that. But today, I want to talk about fasting. Let me say at the beginning, if this is at all interesting to you and you would like to join me on Wednesdays during Lent, send me an email. We're going to pull a little group together. We'll support and pray for each other. We'll share whatever it is that we discover. But these spiritual practices remind us that faith is an inside job. And that's the title of this series. A title I borrow from Brian McLaren, who in this very spot 7 years ago preached to us about these 3 spiritual practices. Here's what he said that day. He said, "We are living in an ecological crisis, but the beginning of the problem out there is in here. The outer ecology reflects the inner ecology of greed, hurry, and carelessness. If we want there to be change out there, it must begin in here." And then he quoted the great prophets, the Spice Girls. He said, "It begins with what you want, what you really, really want." It always begins with what we really, really want. Can you think of 2 greater problems in our world than our insatiable appetite for money, power, and pleasure? And the beauty of these practices is each one of them is an antidote to our worst problems, individually and societally. Think about it. What is the antidote to our insatiable appetite for money? What is the antidote to greed? It's giving to the poor. It's being committed to raising up others. It's being committed to the common good. And what's the antidote to our insatiable appetite for pleasure? It's fasting. It's learning how to set limits in a culture that doesn't want to have us set any limits. It's learning how to say no to the right things and yes to the right things. And what's the antidote for our insatiable appetite for power? It's prayer. It's learning to say, not my kingdom, my will, my way, but yours be done. So let's talk today about fasting. First of all, let me just tease away something that has got attached to fasting for many of us. Fasting is not that we don't fast because pleasure is a bad thing. Pleasure is good. Let me just give you some tangible reasons why I believe that with all my heart. First of all, it says it in the Bible. We begin with a blessing. God says it's good, good, good. All of it's good, right? Why else would God create taste buds? Why would God give us a tickle button? Why would God create such beauty if pleasure wasn't good? We are, I believe, called to enjoy this life, to enjoy pleasure. So pleasure is good. Just hear that loud and clear. But pleasure is dangerous because it's so addictive. Now, I'm going to use addiction in the general sense. I know that there are many of us who struggle with the illness of addiction, and this will speak to some of that, but I'm speaking more broadly. We live in an addictive society. We are conditioned to be addictive to things, to addiction to pleasure and entertainment. I mean, we could have entertainment for 24 hours a day for the rest of our lives. There's so much out there for us to consume. And the thing about pleasure is it does work. It does make us feel better for a period of time. But did you ever notice that the things that made you feel better make you feel a little bit less better each time you go to them? And that's how addiction starts. The pleasure becomes a little bit less, so we need more and more of a higher dose of pleasure. And that's how we get pulled down into this endless cycle of addiction and consumption. Addiction is destructive. It's destructive not only to ourselves, it's destructive to our relationship with God because we look for things that are not God to provide us what only God can provide. It's destructive to our soul because we are feeding our soul with things that ultimately aren't nourishing. And it's destructive to our relationships because rather than appreciate what we have, we become fixated on what we don't have. And it creates this graspy, clingy energy that just wants more and more of what satisfies us less and less. I think you can see that all throughout our culture, and I hope you can notice that within yourselves. So fasting is saying no. It's about saying no to two things, to pleasure and to the shortcuts to pleasure that we often adopt in our lives. Now, there are many shortcuts to pleasure. I could list hundreds of them, but let me just pick out 4. Drugs and alcohol, pornography, mindless scrolling through social media, vegging out in front of cable TV news. All of these are addictive. Now, all of these are rooted in some good desire, but these are shortcuts to really satisfying that deeper desire. Drugs and alcohol are a search for the transcendent. The problem is we wake up the next day and we feel more disconnected from the divine, from the transcendent than we did when we started. Pornography is rooted in a desire for intimacy, but all it does is really scratch the itch of intimacy. It doesn't provide us what we most long for. Scrolling through social media can help us feel connected for a brief moment to all these people in our lives who are our friends, but it's not the same as a small group meeting on Zoom or in person. Putting on cable TV news and getting outraged at how messed up everything is may feel like we're being engaged, but it is not the same thing as marching, writing letters, making a difference in the world through political engagement. And so during Lent, I invite you to fast from some of your shortcuts to pleasure because they don't satisfy. And when we're honest, we know that. So I invite you, if you'd like, to say no to drugs and alcohol, but don't forget to say yes to the transcendent. Say no to pornography, but say yes to intimacy in all its beautiful forms. I invite you to say no through scrolling endlessly on social media, but say yes to picking up the phone or writing a card or meeting with someone for coffee. Say no to putting the TV on in the background so that there's some noise, and practice maybe in silence reading the newspaper and really diving into what's going on and consider how you might help. So that's the first part of fasting I want to lift up. The second is fasting from good things, from pleasure, good pleasure. Now, why would we ever do that? And admittedly, there's something about this that doesn't make sense. I mean, if you want to take fasting to its logical conclusion, you stop eating food, that's not going to work out so well if we keep doing that for days after days and weeks after weeks. We need food to survive. Now, some of us can fast from certain foods that actually aren't that healthy. But what we do when we fast is we fast for something good, something necessary, something that we need for our survival so that we can better remember that those good things come from God's hand. C.S. Lewis said it's like tracing the sunbeam back to the sun and remembering and giving thanks for the fact that there's a sun. That's fasting from good things. It's also remembering that God has provided these things for all God's children. And the reality is there are children and adults dying from starvation in our country and in our world. So we fast to be a little bit more mindful of the people that are really hungering today. Talk about evil. Talk about injustice. Talk about what must break God's heart. Gandhi said the world has enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everybody's greed. This is a problem that we could solve if we had the will to solve it. And maybe our comfortable lives are in the way of that reality. And so we fast in solidarity with those who hunger. One of my favorite groups I've ever been a part of in my old church was called the Fast Lane. It was created by a lot of people who were commuting in and out of New York City. And it was actually inspired because one of the guys came up to me and says, I see these homeless people, I don't know what to do. I said, well, let's see if we can do something together. So during Lent, we decided that we would fast on Wednesdays. Our church would have a worship service on Wednesday. We'd have like a soup supper, which is what I want to institute here. We would get together, and then the group that was fasting with me, we would gather in the parlor room as a small group, and somebody would bake bread, and we'd break this bread and we enjoy it. We would share our experiences of the day, which were often incredibly meaningful. And then we would put the money that we would have spent on our own breakfast and lunch, we put it into a little, pot. And at the end of Lent, we wrote a nice big check and sent it to a cause that was fighting against extreme poverty. This group continued for a number of years, and one Lent, the group didn't want to end. And so we kept going, and we met for another couple of years. Every week, fasting, once a month meeting. A beautiful experience. Fasting has a way of reminding us of our dependence upon God. It's a way in which we can return to God and return to God's people with all our heart. Years ago, when I was beginning ministry, I'd be preaching about these things. And what's one of the beautiful things about preaching is you have to, in the end, preach to yourself. And so I began to realize when I would talk about fasting, I was scared to death of fasting, like unreasonably scared of fasting, to the point where I started to wonder. And I think part of the reason that I'm curious, but I think some of it was also my competitiveness and my stubbornness. I started to look at this, and I sensed maybe God was calling me to fasting, and my resistance was just simply confirmation of that call. And so I started to fast. And honestly, it was even harder than I thought it would be. It really was. But most difficult for me were some of the insights that I gained through it. The first insight was I realized that I didn't eat when I was hungry. I ate to ward off my hunger. You know the difference? I realized I was afraid of feeling hunger. I was afraid of being vulnerable. And so I would eat so that I wouldn't have to feel that way. The other thing that I discovered was that when I was hungry, I started to see the poor a little differently. I could be as judgmental as the rest. Well, these people are so lazy. They don't work. They don't this. And then I realized, oh my God, some of these people are raising families. They're going to work every day, and they're hungry. How do they even function? It was like a shift of perspective. It was like I put on a new set of glasses, and I started to ask, how are they even able to survive being as hungry as they are? And the other thing, perhaps the most painful realization, was I realized that when I was hungry and I was working, I was just a little bit off. I didn't feel like myself. I didn't feel like I was as charismatic as I want to be. I was off my A game. And then I started to realize maybe my A game is my way of keeping God at bay and saying, okay, God, I'll take it from there. And what I discovered when I was working and I was hungry, I was more likely to let other people help. I was more likely to be open to what God would have me do, not what I was telling myself that I needed to do. And that became a gift. You see, fasting brings us face to face with our vulnerability. That's why I think it's so threatening. At least that's what it was for me. It reveals and uncovers the ways that we're all running away from vulnerability. None of us want to be vulnerable. And so we wall ourselves off in all kinds of different ways, just so that we don't feel that vulnerability. But the truth is, so much good can happen when we're in touch with that vulnerability, because everything we do to avoid it in the end brings more suffering into our lives. And none of the things that we wall ourselves off from vulnerability, the pleasures that we seek, will ever deliver on their promise. One of my teachers at the Living School used to say, He'd say this over and over. He'd say, we are made in such a way that nothing less than infinite union with infinite love will satisfy. Nothing less than infinite union with infinite love will satisfy. It's like St. Augustine, who said our hearts are restless until they find their rest in God. Or Pascal, who said God has created in each of us a God-shaped vacuum. That's our longing. And only God can fill that. Let me close with a question that haunted me this week. It turned into this poem, but it was a question that I was given. What is more dangerous, Mark? The illusion of your invulnerability or the reality of your vulnerability? What is more dangerous? And here's what spilled out. The illusion of invulnerability is infinitely more dangerous than the reality of our vulnerability. Why waste time and energy trying to make more content a self whose destiny is toast? Why not embrace the little deaths, the ones we resist yet hold the promise of our liberation? Death by 1,000 cuts need not be a cause for lament, but an opportunity for freedom. This seed we call self was never intended to remain intact. It was destined to break open. So let new life flow. Embrace your vulnerability. Live your life now. Amen.